In the markets today, the Altarian dollar fell over 300 points against the Qin yuan after the king of Western Camacha accused its eastern neighbour of widespread and deliberate wind theft. Markets had to be temporarily paused, but on the resumption of trading, stocks in companies with widespread holdings in Hexguil shored on the news that the country intends to protect its investment in wind technology. Next, over to Michelle Fish with the weather.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Sasharissa. You're looking great today. It sounds like the markets are a little choppy right now, which is pretty much the opposite of what we're looking at for the weather over the coming few days. Let's start with today's weather. Well, there was a cold front moving in from the south, and with that, we'd have expected to see some pretty major thunderstorms, heavy rain, and possibly even some tornadoes in these outer regions. But it seems someone has stolen the wind. All the wind. The warm front expected to come in from the west also appears to have disappeared, and with it, the expected spring warmth. That's gone too. In fact, with the theft of the wind, it looks like the weather is at an end. Without the wind blowing through the trees, the subtle flickering of the dappled light through the shade, the gentle movement of the clouds across a pale blue sky, all things shall come to a stop. Will we no longer hear the whispering of the trees? Will children no longer laugh in the streets? The oceans, will they stand still, and time, will it end? Okay, so on to the outlook for next week. In the news at the moment, there's a lot of talk about a thing that's real. A thing that can be a problem, and sometimes is a problem, and which, of course, the fossil fuel lobby, and in particular one Western regime with its propaganda arm, is using the tiny little kernel of truth to spread fear and misinformation about renewable energy. And that problem is wind theft. And of course, when you're running a country on fear and othering, and you've just simply got to scare your supporters just enough so they'll never vote for the other person, even though you regularly insult your own base behind and sometimes in front of their back, you're going to need something pretty strong to motivate them. Saying the thing they should be scared of is stealing from them, or threatening their lives or their families, that's pretty motivating. Or eating their pets. That kind of ridiculous claim works too, apparently. Before I go any further, I should acknowledge that the fear and loathing tactic is one that's been used for years against renewables, just as the very same people who share those lies become strangely myopic to the impact of the fossil fuel industry. As we know, fossil fuel industries are horrific for their pollution effects, both at, say, around the site of the fossil fuel energy generation, where massive increases in cancer and long-term illnesses exist, but also at downstream locations, like where their waste ends up, or in rivers and streams, when pollution leaches out and kills entire rivers' worth of biodiversity. This follows their pattern of every accusation being an admission of guilt. Similarly, we've heard accusations that wind turbines are bird-murdering machines, again skipping deftly over the impacts of pollution on wildlife and the number of birds that may die as a result of ingesting the resultant waste from, say, burning coal or oil. But unlike those utter nonsense allegations directed at wind power, wind theft can have real challenges, both in terms of large-scale planning and in terms of international relations, it turns out. And, perhaps most pleasingly for them, this story's got the tiny little kernel of truth that they can wrap in a massive stack of lies that makes it much harder to just wave it away as the right wing donning its tinfoil hats again.
We've convinced carbon-based beings that carbon is a problem.
Let me tell you, you're a conspiracy theorist, and the left and the media spreads more conspiracy theories.
Activities. I mean, he defended the empire against unelected hippies.
CO2 is contained in that. So the number, and take this away, 0.04% of the atmosphere is CO2. So it's not this existential threat as pronounced by those that want to regulate you and control where you go, how you drive, even so far as to what you eat.
Our programming does not permit us to acknowledge that any creature is superior.
That there's something other than even an anti-carbon dioxide agenda that's driving that system of ideas.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
Yes, Alex, gay. That's what we're doing. We're trying to turn the frogs gay. Perhaps it's time you get some sleep. So let's talk about where wind comes from, what impacts wind farms actually have on it, what the research actually says about quote-unquote wind theft, or as it's perhaps somewhat more formally known, wind farm-induced wakes, or wind shadowing, and what we need to do about it. Okay, the wind. It turns out that, at least until proven otherwise, the wind is not a result of insufficient or possibly overly sufficient gifts to Enlil, and is instead caused mostly by changes in atmospheric pressure. Those changes in pressure come from uneven heating of the Earth by the sun, because the Earth is, accountancy shanty notwithstanding, a somewhat squashed sphere, and the sun heats the Earth unevenly. Bits of the Earth are closer to the sun than others, and things like rocks heat up quicker than water. About twice as fast, actually, because rocks typically have about half the heat capacity of water. And yes, that is why it is utterly terrifying that the land temperature went up by more than 2 degrees last year, because that's an indicator of where we're heading. It's just that the oceans are taking longer to come to the boil, but the heat energy is hitting the Earth, it's not escaping, and it's going somewhere. Now, once we've got some hot air, other than that produced as a side product of the giant festering pile of cow dung inside Kilishasi House, in one place, that makes the air less dense, which makes it both get bigger and rise. In return, the areas which haven't been heated as much get cooler and more dense, and the air there sinks. Now, as the old saying goes, nature abhors that's not quite right. Nature abhors a vacuum. And if the cold air just shuffled out the way downwards and you had a big gap, or if the warm air just rose up and nothing replaced it, apart from, the fact that there'd be people suddenly standing in a region that'd be a little short on the old oxygen that most of us like to breathe, then what we'd have suddenly is vacuums popping up all over the place. So rather than a sudden uptick in Hoover sales, what happens? Air moves to fill that space. It moves from the side or wherever, and that air is felt as wind. Now, there's lots more depth we could go into. For example, the equator gets direct sunlight year-round, which means that the middle bit of the Earth tends to be warmer than the poles. Shocking, I know. That temperature differential creates, and to a degree maintains, some of the large-scale wind systems that are responsible for the climate behaviour that we've been used to. Mountains, being quite solid objects, cause air to rise, something called orthographic lifting, which creates windward and leeward sides. The windward one is wet and the other dry. And like I mentioned, since water heats up slowly and releases that heat slowly, that causes sea breezes and land breezes near coasts. There's also, something called the pressure gradient force. Hang on, let's hand over to weather girl Jane Ketley. As you can see over here, over Churston-on-Sea, these isobars, they're really close together. Those tight bars here mean that you're going to get winds moving very swiftly. That's because there's a big pressure difference across a very short distance. And I know that all you weather fans will know this already, but the wind doesn't travel either along or across these isobars. Instead, as you'd expect with the Coriolis effect, if we were in the southern hemisphere, then the winds, well, they'd be curving to the left. Unfortunately, being in the northern hemisphere as we are, things seem to be rather dramatically curving to the right, despite our lack of proximity to the poles. Look, we could talk about the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, and the polar cells. We could talk about the subtropical and polar jet streams and their imminent collapses. We could talk about the smaller scale stuff like local seasonal wind shifts that cause monsoons. We could talk about katabatic and anabatic winds. They're the winds you get in valleys and slopes. Katabatic winds are particularly fun to enjoy if you happen to have the opportunity to stand near a glacier before they all melt. But I think you get the general gist. And yes, for those of you playing along at home, climate change with its impacts on the world's temperature gradients will fundamentally play havoc with the wind. We've talked on the channel briefly in the past about how the jet streams are becoming less stable. They wander around more and the polar jet streams are likely to shift, meaning rainy, turfy Ireland will get more rainy in parts of the year, hot and dry for some parts of the year, and colder than J.K. Rowling's heart at other times. But also, southern Europe will get more and more arid. None of this is good, but onwards we go with dumping our CO2 and methane into the atmosphere like nothing's wrong. Right, so that's where wind comes from. Now, of course, wind turbines do, in fact, extract energy from wind. That's what they're there to do.
And in other news, completely and totally independent experts at the non-partisan advocacy group Fossils First warn that the rapid expansion of wind farms will lead to investors who've placed their money in earlier wind farms losing money. The devastating impact of wind theft on these early investors really means that we really need the government to step in and prevent a rise in what they're already terming windflation. We're joined here by financial expert Irma Not-a-Shill.
It's really simple economics. If too many turbines are built, they'll start competing for limited wind resources. We've already seen cases where upwind farms steal the gusts before they reach downwind facilities. It's like a game of musical chairs, but with billion-dollar propellers. That's why we are advocating for a tax on these wind farms. They're taking this energy without paying for it. In the meantime, we can keep building the good old, reliable fossil fuel plants which have proven themselves over hundreds of years.
Thank you so much, Irma. Next, our lead automotive reporter, Jeremy Hammond, explains why paying endlessly for servicing costs for a petrol car is much better investment than paying far less for an EV.
No. Wind turbines do, obviously, extract energy from wind. Quite a lot, as it happens, and a lot more now than they used to. And because the laws of physics say that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred, the passage of wind over turbine blades causes some of the wind's energy to be transferred to the turbine blades, then to the actual generator hub, then to electrical energy, thanks to the wonders of electromagnetism. The wind keeps on blowing after it's passed through the turbines, but it's lost just a tiny fraction of its energy. The whole hysteria that we're hearing right now on the right is based on that tiny bit of science combined with occasional bits of very, very poor planning. You see, if you have a massive number of wind turbines lined up one after another and the prevailing wind passes through them, the strength of the wind will gradually reduce. What's more, those spinning turbines create a sizable wake behind them, much like an airplane turbine, disrupting the airflow for anything downwind of the turbines. How far that airflow is disturbed depends on the size of the turbines and how fast they're spinning and the technology the turbine has. Oh, but Kate, What has this got to do with wind theft? Well, I'm glad you asked. And if you didn't, I'm going to pretend you did. Obviously, the disruptions to wind patterns downwind of a turbine will eventually sort themselves out, because, as I already mentioned, wind is caused by pressure gradients, and they don't just vanish because a wind turbine is there. But it's also not immediate. And here's the crux of the problem. Wind farms aren't always being properly sited, and areas known for abundant wind end up with wind farm after wind farm after wind farm with little space in between. And when that happens, the farm that's downwind from the rest generates less electricity on a windy day than the farm that's upwind. And if the company that put their wind farm there didn't model it right, or the one that's built upwind of them appears after they've built the downwind one, then everyone from the investors to the grid to the end user gets to be unhappy. Luckily though, technology and decent planning can fix that. To the first bit. When grid powering wind turbines started to appear in the 80s, they typically had an efficiency of around 20%. To give you an idea of where we were at back then, the first UK wind turbine lived on the Orkney Isles and was a 3.7 megawatt turbine which had a 60-metre span on its blades and sat atop a 45-metre concrete tower. As of October 2024, the Vestas V236 wind turbine was the tallest in the world. Standing at 280 metres tall, this 25 megawatt beast isn't the most powerful though. At the moment, that honour either goes to the Siemens Gamesa 21 megawatt unit at Oostereld in Denmark with its 276 metre rotor, or Goldwind in China's with its 292 metre model, which may produce as much as 25 megawatts. And it's not just because these turbines are massive that they're so much more powerful than the 1980s LS1. The extra height does help, because taller towers allow turbines to reach the stronger winds found at higher altitudes, and because surface obstacles, trees, buildings, cars, all these things cause interference to the flow of the wind. Obviously, the higher tower height enables you to have longer blades. It provides better clearance for longer blades, and longer blades mean that they sweep more area, capturing more wind. And that large swept area means that they can harvest enough to turn even in areas where there's not enough wind to turn a smaller turbine. And those huge blades? How did we get them, I hear? Absolutely no one asking, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Back in 2012, we saw an enormously important change which improved wind turbine technology. Blades that could twist and which could bend, and coupled that with a flat back aerofoil. These dramatically reduced the cost of energy production from turbines by around 20%. And they were a component of the design changes that allowed the dramatic extension in blade length that we've seen. They weren't patented changes either. And that design, that research, that came about from, I'll take agencies being gutted by Elon Musk and his pet Mango Mussolini that previously led to huge advances in energy generation and lots of nice income for the government for 400, Alex. Yeah, a DOE project. I'm sure glad the US government is continuing to invest in technologies of the future like... well, I suppose they'll have lots of money to invest in a massive expansion in baby caskets, which, since we're basically giving up on vaccination, will be a rapidly growing industry here. Did you know that the US already has the highest maternal and pediatric mortality rate in the quote-unquote high-income world? And prior to vaccination, only around 1 in 5 children made it to their 5th birthday. I guess when certain politicians implied they wanted to take the US back to the 1800s, they really, really meant it. At least now we know it's a great time to invest in funeral services. Anyhow, one other big and more recent innovation which has also had a huge impact on the industry is the use of silicon carbide semiconductors. Silicon carbide was actually around back at the birth of the semiconductor industry, but a variety of challenges, defects when growing crystals, for example, made it challenging to produce sufficient quality and size of wafer. But with recent advances in manufacturing, silicon carbide semiconductors have made massive inroads into high power and high efficiency applications, like wind turbine power inverters. That's because silicon carbide based power electronics operate with much lower energy loss than traditional devices. They're also much more thermally stable and can switch faster at higher power levels. Many power inverters operate with high frequency switching and require thermal stability at high power levels and with low levels of energy loss. So look, we found the thing we need to do that better. And so silicon carbide based power electronics allow for a huge increase in efficiency and in power capabilities in general. And those factors combined mean that we're now seeing wind turbines with efficiencies around 50%, nearing the Betz limit, which is the theoretical maximum efficiency of a wind turbine. That, for those of you who are wondering, is around 59%. And all this is good news, because we know that even at current hub heights, global onshore and offshore wind generation has the potential to provide 872,000 terawatt hours per year of energy generation. That's around 32 times the total global use of electricity in 2022. For the US, its continental wind generation potential of 43,000 terawatt hours per year exceeds by a massive margin the US's 4,000 terawatt hours of energy consumption in 2022. In the EU, the European Commission's strategy for offshore renewables released in 2020 planned for 300 gigawatt hours of offshore renewables. That would make up roughly half of the 600 or so gigawatts of the EU's planned rollout by 2050. The EU, incidentally, is only looking to generate around half of its energy from wind. Although, yes, LLMs and sticking AI into everyone's microwave and toaster oven so that they can inaccurately tell you to add some glue to your pizza topping and make sure you get your daily allowance of rocks is having horrific impacts on energy consumption, which may make some of the earlier assumptions about energy consumption inaccurate. But still. Okay, so wind turbines could broadly, theoretically, at least meet our energy demands. Though obviously we can't put them everywhere that we could theoretically put a wind turbine. They are extracting more energy from the wind more efficiently, and they're starting to be positioned offshore where they can be even taller to harvest even more.
I mean, it leaves you with the question right now, is wind theft, is it really such a big problem? Because right now, it just doesn't seem that way. Back to you in the studio.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that the Awaken study just concluded by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, a branch of the Department of DOE,
Kate, were you not wearing your Giugenta 200 superchromatic peril sensitive glasses? You've got to be more careful.
Oh, fine, whatever. Okay, thankfully, the data for Awaken was collected through 2022 and 2023 and hopefully has been captured in the projects to use distributed torrents to preserve the data that the US government is hell-bent on destroying. The aim of the project was to validate wind power plant models because the models available to predict losses from turbine interactions at the inception of the project had massive uncertainty levels. We're talking up to 50%. Which brings me to the second point, planning. See, if your plant generates 50% less power than your model is expecting, that's gonna suck for everyone. And if your offshore wind plant happens to interfere with your neighbouring country's neighbouring wind plant, well, that's going to lead to some tricky diplomatic discussions. And to be clear, this is not a new piece of knowledge. We've had ongoing research and discussions about the legislative and regulatory challenges of large-scale wind deployments that are near each other, or that might interfere with another country's ability to utilise wind power for literally decades. As it stands, the UN Law of the Sea Convention indicates that states have the sovereign right to extract energy from wind. It does not address cross-border wake effects. As it stands, there's indications that offshore wind farms can reduce the availability of downstream wind resources of other farms by as much as 20% within 50 kilometres. That's significant enough to cause problems. Back in March of this year, German utility RWE accused Iberidola's Scottish Power, amongst others, of wind theft, claiming that projects planned in British waters would negatively impact its existing generation facilities. But the real problem here is not the technical one. That's soluble with data and research. The real problem is that the uncoordinated rollout of renewables has the possibility of negatively impacting existing facilities, or just not making the best use of our available resources. Rather than the ad hoc approach of companies picking and choosing the bits of land they fancy to build whatever on, renewables rollout should be something that's being planned at a national, or frankly even international level. It should be something that we invest time and energy into, because otherwise we risk wasting potential. And while the current regime in the US and the fossil fuel lobby are desperate for us to throw away that potential, doing so is something we absolutely should not tolerate. Before we get into the credits today, a huge thank you to Monstead, Copper, Joe and Tom, whose invaluable help in the Discord chat enabled us to crowdsource the videos that made the tinfoil hat section that much better. Thanks for joining us today, and if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them in our Discord room, on our Patreon page, down below, or you can reach out to us on Mastodon or Blue Sky. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They're part of the massive community of supporters who make this channel possible, helping us through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and helping us to remain 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here and mispronounced horribly by me, just follow the links below. We've got options across a range of different price points from $1.50 US a month. A massive welcome to our newest supporters: Baz Meendertsma, Dan Morton, DX Watt, There's Jer, Magnetar Explorer, Ron THX1138, Jonas V, John Leonard, Joe Weekend Dog Dad, Yalalfi, David Hardin, Enzo Tickus, Ed Runyon, Beth S, Mitch Rassner, Brad Crowshawn, Leighton, Dennis, Stephen Beetle, Albert Beatty, Peterson, Ya, Todd Fraser, Rick B, Paul, Andrew Diet, Tim Bedford, John Salmons, Sar Gibson, JTPDX, Tyler Walker, Gary Dean Mercer Clark, Roboman410, and John Galley. To join the list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your moment of fame, and you can even gift membership to someone else. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations. And we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at, for the time being, addressed below. You'll also find links to our swag store, and if you are someone who has to shop on Amazon, please consider using our affiliate link so we get the commission, not Jeff Bezos. So we can continue to focus on making our content even better and reduce burnout, we're being a little freer with our release days, but plan on dropping new content every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday on our main channel, plus something on Sunday over on TE Take 2. If you want more, the algorithm that hates us thinks you should be watching this video, but this video is the one we'd like you to check out. Be kind, be awesome, be intentional, and don't forget to resist. Keep evolving!